Hello and welcome to Working Lunch, the SLO Chambers weekly series where we connect with community leaders and get to know the person behind the position. I'm Jim D'Antona, CEO of the San Luis Chamber, and I hope you had a wonderful 4th of July holiday weekend. We're thrilled you're back here with us for today's conversation with SLO City Manager Derek Johnson. Before coming to San Luis Obispo, Derek served as the Director of Community Development in the City of Capitola and as Santa Barbara County's Director of Long Range Planning, honing his expertise in infrastructure financing and redevelopment, as well as organizational development and change management. In 2011, Derek and his family made the jump to SLO, where he became the city's Community Development Director, jumping headfirst to updating the general plan. He's also served as the city's finance director and assistant city manager prior to being hired for the top job. I'm so looking forward to talking with Derek about how he got his start in local government, what it means to be a leader in this moment, and his vision for the future. Derek, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thanks, Jim. Thanks for having me today, and really happy to have this conversation and always excited to be here with the Chamber.
Well, as folks sit down to lunch, love to know where you're zooming in from today.
I am zooming in from my office here at City Hall, and where I've been at pretty much straight for the last 400 plus days as we've working through the pandemic.
Well, it's been great work, and we'll be diving into a lot of the amazing things the city's done. But I always like to start by learning a little more about how people's career path started. Maybe you can take us back to Derek as a child. What was life like? What did you think you wanted to be when you grew up?
Well, I grew up in Marin County, California, in a little part of the northern part of Marin County. Novato is a working class town, and lots of firemen and police officers, and it had a aging military base, Hamilton Air Force Base. And so what brought my family there was both my grandparents on my mother's side were both military officers. My grandfather was a colonel, and my grandmother was a major in the Army, and they both served in the Pacific Theater. And so I grew up in a house with the parents that were, my father was in the Navy. He was in submarines. And so I grew up with a lot of military presence, a lot of families in this town that worked in some form in the military. My first jobs growing up was, I don't even know if this job I don't think it even exists anymore, was paper routes. I had a paper route. I delivered the Novato Advance and the Marin Independent Journal. I had two paper routes. One side of my BMX bike, I'd have one paper, and the other one I'd have the other, and I'd ride down the street around 5 in the morning and throw papers out. And that was my first job that I ever had.
And it's so funny. It's talk about great responsibility. I remember I served as a sub on one of those for a friend, and woo, that's a lot of crazy work. Did you get to, obviously with both parents coming out of the military, was that kind of driven in as part of that kind of work ethic, to get out and get things going?
Yeah, I think that, my grandfather in particular, we had lots of conversations early on, which got me oriented towards public service. I mean, he had high hopes for me, and he said, I hope you're a Supreme Court justice. And, that was always, he'd always hoped that he would been able to get into law. He was never able to do that just because he ended up dedicating his career in military service. And so that was certainly intriguing for me early on, but there were other people in my life that really had a strong impression on me. One was my civics teacher in high school, Mr. Harms. I can remember sitting in his office and kind of dazzled by the scales of justice that he had up there. And we would have these long philosophical conversations with a group of individuals after school about, what was it like to be, what was a republic, what was a democracy, and the role of the federal, state, and local government. That primed me and my friends to run for office in high school, and we won our slate. I was the treasurer. I wasn't the face of the campaign, but I was could run the money.
Well, and I think that has definitely paid off long term. We've been, as the chamber, we're obviously certainly supportive of all the great work you've done for our city that way. Did that lead? What kind of got you to UCSB? Because that's where you went to college, right?
Yeah, I went to UCSB. I went to UCSB via I spent some time in the U.S. Army Reserves, so I followed footsteps, and so I was a combat signaler, and then I did weekend warrior work for some time. What brought me to UCSB is I had an interest in environmental science and biology, and they were right on the beach. They had great programs. I had some good friends from high school that drew me down there since I started a year later than all of them. So, and last thing I wanted to do was to live in the dorms after living in the barracks. And so I needed kind of a foot in the door, so to speak, to kind of help grease the skids, and had a great time at UCSB, and was able to eventually, stay on and, make a career there.
Well, so you obviously kind of pivoted from kind of those environmental sciences, marine biology. Did you get is that where you kind of made that switch over to government at the tail end of your time there at UCSB?
I spent some time working with some really great professors. I graduated from college at the time. We were just coming out of the S&L scandals. The economy was doing pretty poorly. There was not a lot of jobs out there. And I quickly realized, I did some work in labs, and I quickly realized that my life, I wasn't going to really enjoy doing a lot of lab. And so I partnered my last year in college and wrote a grant to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to help acquire some property from Chevron, and to establish some wetlands in the coastal zone. And eventually that grant was actually awarded. Little did I know that it would open up a world of regulatory introductions with the Coastal Commission, with the Army Corps of Engineers. And so it really was my foray into kind of getting a project off the ground and what it took.
Well, it sounds a little bit more than a foray, because you jumped into the really deep end. Coastal Commission, Army Corps of Engineers. That's not any light reading or pieces that fit together very simply. And obviously that helped you kind of get connected, I'm sure, through all different levels of government there.
It certainly did. I was great. I was fortunate to have a thesis advisor and someone who worked with me to help me navigate all of those different channels. And that's really been one of the themes about my career, is then from doing that work, I eventually got hired by a special district in Isla Vista. And so at the ripe age of 25, I became the general manager. And I literally had no idea what I was doing. I think they saw someone who was bright and ambitious, and fortunately, some other people took me under their wing. Our auditor controller down in Santa Barbara County, who was featured over and over again in the Wall Street Journal for his work in government finance. So he taught me about everything he knew about government finance. So I've been fortunate to have people like that all along the way who've helped me.
Well, and as I said, obviously you held a number of roles down there in Santa Barbara and Capitola before coming here as community development director. Obviously, having really done a lot of early work down there, what spurred you to come to San Luis?
So in my time working at this special district in Isla Vista, it is a petri dish for a lot of challenges. Everything from homelessness to substandard housing conditions to parks and recreation facilities to solid waste issues to municipal finance. I got all of it. And what I quickly realized, I didn't have kind of the full toolkit, and so I didn't have the ability to, as a special district, we didn't have land use authority. We didn't have a lot of the police powers. And there were some areas that I thought, we could do this better. So I eventually got recruited, worked for the county of Santa Barbara did some work in kind of their think tank and said, hey, I want to find my way to a city. I want to find my way to become a city manager. In fact, when Katie Lichtig hired me as a community development director, she said, hey, what do you want to be when you quote unquote grow up? And I quickly said, hey, I want to be a city manager. In 5 years, that's what I want to do. And so that's how I saw myself, and being in the key pole position of helping communities realize what they want to do.
And was there some in those initial days kind of coming to SLO? Did you see something here that you thought that kind of ability to help you grow or do the things you wanted to do?
Yeah, well, yeah, I have this story that I talk about, which is I think that when California was settled by the Spanish, that they picked the prime locations. I mean, where all the missions are, that's where you want to be, whether it's Santa Barbara, San Juan Capistrano, Santa Cruz, and San Luis Obispo. And so it has a lot of the right amenities, water, and typically a university. It's got a good urban fabric. It's got an engaged community. We're the 16th incorporated city out of over 480 cities. So we're one of the earliest cities that was incorporated in the state. We're actually older than the state of California itself, and to some extent. And so, looking at just all of the qualities of SLO, I said, this is where I can come and have an impact and make a difference. Having spent my time in Santa Barbara, and I love Santa Barbara, it's a fabulous community. I quickly realized that part of my job was seemingly at sometimes to make sure that things did not happen. And I became very frustrated with that and said, we can do better. And at that time, when I arrived in SLO in 2011, there seemed to be impetus to how can we make San Luis Obispo better? And I wanted to be a part of that.
Well, in my own time in local government, I heard a number of different versions of what residents think a city manager does. Maybe you can help kind of set the record straight and give us that elevator pitch on what your role entails. Also, maybe a few of the most common misconceptions that you hear.
Yeah, well, I'll start off with the misconceptions. People think oftentimes that the mayor runs the day-to-day operations of the city. In our form of government here, which is a mayor, council, city manager, the city manager runs the day-to-day operations. The mayor and the council, they make policy and oversee the budget. They in turn oversee only two of the city employees, and that's the city attorney and the city manager. I in turn hire everyone else. One of the misperceptions, though, is that unlike a CEO in the in the private sector, which I have done that in my time, in the public sector, when a city manager decides to do something, that's usually the beginning of a conversation. In the private sector, when a CEO decides to do something, that's the end of the conversation, and usually you're headed in the right direction. So oftentimes when I tell people what I do, they'll say, oh, you're the planner. Are you the city clerk? So they don't really understand. And when finally I say, hey, I'm the equivalent of a CEO, but for a municipal corporation, that's when people make the connection.
One of those first things that I learned about you was that you were an avid cyclist, and folks might not know that cycling actually is a team sport. Even though the captain is usually the most visible person, the whole team kind of makes the thing run. Do you feel that city manager role is similar to that lead cyclist on a team?
Absolutely. It is one where cycling is a team sport, and there are properties of being on a cycling team. I tell people cycling is a sport where it's akin to racing at 30 miles an hour, playing chess and holding your breath. And it feels like that. But in the case of being a city manager, your team, your cycling team, is your executive team. So your community development director, your police chief, your fire chief, they're all pulling. And so sometimes on a cycling team, sometimes you're at the front of the peloton and sometimes you're at the back. And what people don't know about cycling is that just the mere physics of it is when you're at the front, you're using 30 to 40% more energy than being at the back of the peloton. And we all know we can't be at the front all the time. So part of my job is to elevate my team, figure out who's the sprinter, who's the hill climber, who's the overall, all-rounder, and then use those skills. And so part of my job is to develop that vision and get people to coalesce around that vision, and then develop a plan, and then use that team to execute that plan.
I think that's an amazing analogy that you just used there, because that is a role of the CEO, right? That manager is to not always necessarily to be the person in front. Sometimes you're finding others to do that. But if you weren't the city manager, is there another role you'd love to have in city government?
If I wasn't this, city manager is the role that I wanted. I'm in city government. I often think about just my own personality, and I love being outdoors. I love being physical. If I was in city government, I'd probably be in the fire service. I love what they get to do. I like the public kind of the servant role that they play in saving and rescuing people and being a guardian for the community. And so that's another department that, or professional avenue of city government that I would love to have pursued.
That sounds fun. You mentioned at the beginning of this that, and at the last city council meeting on Tuesday, that it had been 476 days since our last in-person council meeting. How did it feel to be back in chambers after such a huge absence?
Yeah, it felt liberating. It was, we have done a lot of work and preparation of making sure that people felt safe, that things went smoothly. It was just so good to see community members. It was good to see people and faces in the crowd, people from the chamber, people who wanted just to come to the podium and talk about issues, to make announcements. There's a lot of people who are talking about, return to quote unquote normalcy and what that looks like. And actually there's people who have created normalcy indices to try to figure out when will we return to normalcy. And for me, having in-person meetings was one of those benchmarks to start to say, hey, how can we do government? Because government feels like it, some aspect of it, we can do a lot of it virtually. We adapted to doing things virtually, but having it done in person, because local government is closest to the people, it just seems natural for us to have the people's business done out in the open and in person.
Well, and I know that one of the things I'm most proud of the city as an organization, but also as a community, having accomplished in those 476 days was the passage of Measure G, which has already been utilized by the city to help our community recover more quickly and thrive into the future. Is there something that sticks out to you as a particularly proud moment in that time?
That's a great question. Measure G has afforded us to have the resources to implement a lot of the dreams and vision in the general plan. You mentioned, Jim, early on that when I came here, that was one of the first tasks, was updating the city's vision and the general plan. And we have now projects underway throughout the city that many people see, new housing that's being built under kind of record numbers. And up until Measure G got passed, we did not have the resources to build the infrastructure that was needed. So projects like the Prado Road overpass, rebuilding the police station, rebuilding fire stations, bike transportation, all of that was beyond our capabilities. And now we have the resources to do that. But then COVID came along, and we had businesses that were experiencing stresses unlike no other time. So our partnership with the chamber, with the SLO County Foundation to provide business grants, to provide 5-day turnaround permits for re-tenanting, to building parklets in response to the pandemic. All of that would have been impossible without the community support in Measure G.
And, what you talked about a lot in there and what we saw from the outside is that ability that, the city really used COVID to think about doing things differently. And kind of given the moment we're in right now, leaders of all types are in positions of having slogged through this long, extremely challenging time. But we're also faced with that real opportunity to rethink what we do and how we do it. What keeps you energized, and how do you keep your team motivated after all the work and stress of the pandemic and possibly thinking about new ways of doing this stuff?
Yeah, there's an Emerson quote that I'm probably going to butcher a little bit here, but and it was gendered based when he said it back, but he said, "Man is not best in his goals, but best in his transitions." And I think that we are in a time where society and the world is going through a transition. I think many people liken it to perhaps the biggest transition that we had in the 20th century, the Industrial Revolution. We're going through another revolution. We don't know what it looks like because we're still in the middle of it. And of course, we still haven't even come out of COVID. And so through the pandemic and through COVID, I realized that we could do a lot of work and make decisions and be action oriented, and that we had the grace to make mistakes and then readjust and adapt. And that's not typically what happens in government. We're so risk averse. We tend to have lots of process and make sure that we worked out all of the risks before we implement something, so we don't get any criticism. And we couldn't afford to do that during an emergency. And so I'm hoping that a lot of the muscle memory we learned towards action and getting things done and building up the trust and confidence that if we don't get it right the first time, that we can pivot and then and make some corrections, that will be the continued relationship that we have with the city.
And I think it is really one of the things I've heard most from the business community, certainly, and others around, that it was nice to see that ability. And hopefully some of those are some of the, from our side out in the community, that we get that muscle memory to learn to give that and say, hey, they tried something, it worked, or whether it didn't, we have an opportunity to fix it. So definitely want to get behind keeping that going. There's obviously so much opportunity to innovate and make some real progress as we emerge from these months of radically different lives and habits. What are the key areas you'd like to see our community discuss?
I certainly want to look at our continued opportunity for housing. We know that we're producing more housing than we ever have, but we clearly know that it's not enough. I was actually just talking with an architect last night at the farmers market, and he was talking about one of the new projects that was being built. That just was completed, and it's already fully tenanted. So we know that there is a huge demand for housing. My wife works for the local school district. She's trying to hire teachers into our market, and great teachers that they want to bring to our county are unable to find housing. And so I know that that's something that we need to continue to do. And that's going to require us to think differently and take different approaches to how we're looking at development. I'm hoping also that the same thing happens with infrastructure. We made a lot of improvements for bike and ped mobility changes. Some of those worked early on, didn't work early on, like closing streets. Some worked, like reducing Monterey down to a 1 lane. And so we're going to need the grace to experiment a little bit more and know that if we make mistakes, that we'll have full intentions of correcting those. I mean, you all know, working in the private sector, that some of the best companies in the world, part of your annual performance evaluation is, tell us about your biggest risk and your biggest failure. Because if you're failing, that means you're trying and you're experimenting. And I want to have the ability to do that here at the city as well.
Yeah, I think you've hit on exactly. And as a community, what we need to be fully connected with our city council, our city development teams, working directly with. So I agree with you. And I hope, kind of for those same things, I think it's really important for our community. In the last couple of minutes, I just wanted to see, thinking about, you were on one of our members of the Chamber's vision team who helped craft our economic vision of Imagine SLO, where we talked about we before me. Do you think that regional cooperation is beginning to take hold and make a difference here? And maybe you've seen it directly with other city managers?
We've got a group of city managers right now and a county administrator that are really working on some of the most difficult issues that we know that we can't do it alone. And big issues like homelessness, where the county of San Luis Obispo, they get the $200+ million a year for services. City gets none, so we were going to rely on them. We know on issues like water resiliency that we need to work together. We have project programs right now to work on how do we manage our groundwater. Those and then lastly, the big one in the room is that during COVID is that we have a planned closure of Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant, and all of us are needing to be working together on how are we going to replace those head of household jobs. How are we going to house, and meet the housing needs for the future? And then the big issues around climate change. It's going to require a lot of cooperation. And I have a lot of confidence in the managers that are in the cities and working with our friends at the county that we can get past some of our differences and focus ultimately on what is the best policy and governance choices for our overall region.
Yeah, I agree. It's really going to be through our collaboration we're going to see success through the whole region, and hopefully we can get around the policy issues that we don't agree on to get to the bigger picture. Yeah, I do really want to make sure that people can stay up to date with what's going on at the city. Where should people go to find out more? Are there any places that are kind of key for us to focus on?
I would certainly focus on, the budget is always where I start my thinking. The budget is how we get things done, and it reflects our priorities. So there will be some really focused conversations in the next year around housing policy, changing some of our standards for design to objective standards to help streamline development, looking at flexible density. We will be looking at policies and a strategy around homelessness so that we can partner with the county of San Luis Obispo. We'll have some additional climate actions that we'll be taking. And then also at the same time, we'll also be hiring in our very first diversity, equity, inclusion manager. And so we will be taking a role both for a city organization and throughout the city to be having conversations about what are we doing to make sure that everyone feels included in San Luis Obispo and they can bring their best self to our community and to the city as an employer.
I think all of those are incredible places to start, and it really talks about the level of work that the city is doing to address these really big issues. And so clearly you can hop on to slocity.org to find those pieces. We will also, if you're in the Facebook, we will link those in the chat here that you can connect. We already have the budget document there, and really be able to connect and get some of those e-notifications of what the city's working on, because it's really important work. And Derek, I just want to say thanks for the amazing work you're doing, and we end our program always the same way. And we want to know, what are you actually looking forward to this weekend?
What I'm looking forward to this weekend is watching the Tour de France. We are on stage 14. Today was actually a big day. A 40-year record was broke in the Tour de France. So I'll be riding my bike and watching the Tour de France, and then enjoying some good local wine with my wife and eating a great meal, and otherwise just enjoying a great quality of life we have here on the Central Coast.
That sounds fabulous and very exciting. Actually, that would be awesome to watch the tour. Derek, thanks so much for spending your time with us. I know you're so busy, but it's really great to hear about all the things you're working on, and get to know you a little better. So thanks for spending the time with us and our listeners.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks you to the Chamber for all your work and everything that you and all your members did over the last 470 plus days. I know it's been equally difficult for all of these businesses to keep their doors open, to keep people unemployed, and we greatly appreciate that on behalf of the city.
Again, it's been a great partnership between our business community, our residents, and our city to, again, support this community. And it's really what makes it such a special place. As always, for you listeners and watchers, if you have questions for our guests, feel free to add them into the Facebook comments below, and Derek and his team will hop on and try to answer them when they get a moment. We thank you all for tuning in. We'll have you join us next week, where we'll be talking to Dave Congleton, and we'll turn the tables where he becomes the guest. We'll talk about his history on the radio, the change or not in tenor of our community dialogue, and the future of talk radio. Appreciate everyone for tuning in. We hope you have a wonderful weekend. Stay healthy and safe out there.